Man, I can't even begin to tell you how many bass this one lure has caught. Hi there, welcome to the Bass Fishing Life. I'm your host, Steve Rogers. Hey, before we get into the video, make sure that you hit that subscribe button. New videos come out 3 times a week, so you want to have that notification bell punched as well. And if you love and can't get enough of bass fishing, make sure you check out our new blog site as well, thebassfishinglife.com. Thank you so very much. Well, for a lot of the country, spring is just around the corner. As a matter of fact, if you're down in the southern part of the United States, those bass have already spawned and you're into the post-spawn already. Up north, the ice is starting to melt. We're thinking pre-spawn, but before we know it, the majority of the country is going to be in springtime fishing. And one of my favorite lures for catching bass in the spring, now we're talking post-spawn here, after the spawn, has got to be just a simple popper. I think this is a lure that oftentimes is overlooked because of its simplicity. I know when my boys were just starting to bass fish, that lure, the popper, was what I tied on first for them. Yes, the trebles made me a little bit nervous, but they did great with them. But I tied on a popper because it gets bites. It gets bites all day. So it was one of those lures that I knew, taking some youngsters out, they could catch fish, get bites, and have a great time. And of course it did just that. But the popper is a serious springtime bass fishing lure, and yes, through the summer and fall as well. But there's something about the spring where I just love fishing the popper, especially when the male bass are guarding the fry. I don't know what it is about these things when they're guarding fry, and I know that's an extremely short window of opportunity, but as soon as I see a little fry school going around, boom, put down everything else I've got and I pick up the popper, and it just catches fish like crazy. Well, we're going to talk about today the equipment setup, the retrieve, and the color selection to take your popper fishing to that next level. So let's go ahead and get started. Probably the number one tip that I can give you to increase the number of strikes you get when fishing a popper is to make sure that you've got the right equipment. And now, as far as the rod goes, this is a situation where you want a medium light, or even a light in some situations, but I prefer a medium light power rated rod with a very slow action. So what that means is the backbone is not real heavy, not real stiff, and the tip of the rod has got quite a bit of flex to it before it gets to that backbone. The very soft action, or the soft taper, is critical for making this popper work the best and not fatiguing you when you're twitching it. So make sure that you've got the right rod for this particular setup. As far as reel goes, doesn't really matter. If you've got the mid-range 6.2, 6.3, that's often, but I fished it with a low gear ratio, a high gear ratio, and I've had success, with all of those. But the rod is definitely critically important. And then as far as line goes, I think monofilament is your best choice here. I definitely do not use fluorocarbon because fluoro sinks and it pulls the nose of that popper down just a little bit, and that's enough to change the action on the lure. So I like using mono because it sits up on top of the water and it keeps that nose of the bait up. So monofilament is my number one choice for a popper, and I've fished it on anything from 10, 15, 20, in that range, so your personal preference will work out there, but I highly suggest using monofilament. Now, as far as the retrieve goes on these particular lures, very much like other topwater lures, or even a jerk bait for that matter, you want to make sure that you're imparting the action or the twitch on a slack line. So probably the number one thing I see that can improve people's popper fishing has to do with that rod. And the number two thing that I run across or see is they're popping that bait with a tight line. If you've got a slack line, just a little bit of slack in there, when you give it that twitch, you're going to get much more action out of the bait, and you're going to get much more reliable action. And what do I mean by reliable? Where that bait is going to give it that true pop as opposed to a pull. If you have a tight line when you give it a twitch, oftentimes that bait is just going to pull through the water and not have that sudden start to it where it gets the pop. So that is really the big difference. A slack line will give you a pop. If you have a tight line, it's going to be more of a pull. So definitely make sure you twitch the bait on a slack line. The other thing to do with it on the retrieve is, out of all the lures that I fish, this particular one seems that I have to really change up the cadence until I get what the fish want on that day. And here's what I mean by that. There are some days where I just barely move it, just almost like a slight gurgle. And then there's other days where those bass really want to twitch it hard and it kicks up a whole bunch of spray in front of the lure. But I'm retrieving, even within the same cast, I'm altering my retrieve to see what those fish want. Let them tell you how they are best going to take it. And by tell you, I mean, are they actually inhaling the lure? Or are they just kind of coming up and swatting at it and not committing? If they're not committing to the lure, and this goes pretty much with all topwaters, there's probably something in the retrieve that they don't quite like. So alter the retrieve until they commit to that lure. Sometimes you're going to want 2 twitches and a pause, sometimes 3, sometimes 4. So definitely mix it up. And this particular lure, the popper, generates a lot of strikes when it's just sitting. Let's say I'm throwing it down a weed line and I see a little pocket in the weed line. I'll twitch and I keep twitching it, but when it gets to that spot that I think may be holding a fish, I'll pause it. I'll just let it sit there for a second. Or if I'm coming across the dock, when I get to the corner of that dock, I'll leave it sit. This is a lure that gets a lot of strikes when it is just sitting, or after it sits on that next pop, it will get a bunch of strikes as well. You can kind of picture those bass really coming up, taking a look at it, and really intrigued by what is sitting there. Because when a popper is just floating on top of the water, man, you talk about an easy meal, and bass love to take advantage of an easy meal. So my number one tip for you as far as retrieve is alter it, mix it up, let the fish tell you what they want on that particular day. Every time you come to what you think is a key target zone, leave that bait sit. And the big reason for that is your hookup ratio goes through the roof when those bass inhale it, when that lure is just sitting. They just grab it, the target's not moving. Very similar to a frog. When that frog is just sitting there, the hookup ratios tend to go up as opposed to when it is moving. So that is how I retrieve a popper. The next thing that I would like to talk about is the color. Most of the baits on the bottom, when you see a popper, they're going to be white. This one here is kind of a silver color. But if you have anything that looks natural like the belly of a fish, you're okay as far as that goes. It took a long time for me in my popper fishing to really put a whole lot of stock in the difference of the color on top, because the majority of the bait is out of the water. But I found on clear water lakes, or lakes where they can come up and get a pretty good look at it, the color definitely does make a difference, because that back half of this bait is sitting there down in the water, and the bass can come up and take a really good look at it. So very similar to the retrieve, if the fish are not committing, and we were talking about altering the retrieve, same thing goes with color. If they're not 100% committing to the lure and taking it, start changing the color, alter the color, and don't wait for 10 fish to not take the lure, to kind of swirl at it and miss. before you change the color. Change the color fairly quickly. Okay, if you get a miss and a miss, I'd be putting a new color on there right away. So keep mixing it up until you find what they like on that particular day. This is another situation. If you have somebody else fishing with you in the boat, a buddy, a spouse, or your kids, have different colors on until you can really dial in what those bass are looking for. Now, if you noticed on these two lures that I've got here, okay, this one has got kind of like a tinsel tail to it, and this one actually has a feather. By far and away, I prefer the feather. I have found on really bright sunny days that tinsel gives a little more flash to it. But there's something about a feather in the water that just looks very lifelike, and probably most anglers that you talk to would agree with that. It kind of breathes and pulses a little bit. So a feather is definitely something I'm always going to have on that back treble hook. If your poppers did not come with a feather, you can buy all kinds of pre-rigged treble hooks out there in the market that have the feathers already on there. But when that bait is just sitting there and you've got that feather off the back and it's just giving a little bit more action back there, I think it helps more bass decide, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and give this thing a shot and commit to it. So as far as the feathers go, I always have one tied on. This is a lure that you can fish it with nothing on the back treble hook, but my opinion is always have something on that back treble hook. I don't think it is going to hurt you, but if you don't have something back there, I think it can make a difference in whether or not that fish will commit to actually taking it. Well, I hope that these popper tips help you out, and you can go out there and take this wonderful, wonderful topwater lure and increase the number of fish that you not only get in the boat, but also increase the number of strikes that you get as well. Remember, twitch it on a slack line, have a medium light or light power rated rod, and make sure that action is a slow action. It has a very, very soft tip. It will help impart more pop as opposed to the pull on the bait. Hey, if you have any questions or suggestions of your own, make sure you drop them down below in the comments. Thank you so very much. And don't forget to go out and encourage someone today. You never know how you might just change their life. For the Bass Fishing Life, I'm your host, Steve Rogers.